The rain poured relentlessly, a dull roar against the city's chaos, as Sebastian Vale's limousine glided through the streets. Inside, the billionaire stared out at the blurred world beyond the tinted windows, his mind preoccupied with business deals and boardroom strategies. A man of relentless ambition, he had built an empire that few could rival. Yet, for all his success, Sebastian carried a void he never acknowledged, a space in his life filled with secrets he'd left buried long ago. Today, however, was different. Today, he was unknowingly driving toward a past he had worked so hard to forget. As the car came to a halt before the weathered gates of an orphanage, Sebastian adjusted his tailored suit, masking his unease behind a practiced expression of calm authority. He had agreed to this visit as part of a PR initiative, a chance to soften his image in the eyes of the public. To him, it was just another event, a brief interruption in his meticulously scheduled life. What he didn't realize was that the moment he stepped out of that car, his life would take a turn he could never have anticipated. Inside the orphanage, the air was warm and thick with the scent of freshly baked bread, but Sebastian's sharp eyes couldn't miss the signs of disrepair: chipped walls, creaking floorboards, and hand-me-down furniture. The children greeted him with shy smiles and whispers, their eyes lighting up at the sight of someone who seemed to belong to an entirely different world. The director, a wiry man with a nervous energy, led Sebastian through the main hall, proudly pointing out the recent renovations made possible by donations. Sebastian nodded politely, his mind already drifting to the next item on his agenda, until his gaze landed on a small figure sitting alone in the corner of the room. It was a little girl, no older than 8, with curly brown hair that framed her pale face. Unlike the other children who watched him with excitement or curiosity, she sat quietly, her big, searching eyes fixed on him. In her hands, she clutched a crumpled photograph. "Who's that?" Sebastian asked, gesturing toward her. "That's Amara," the director replied, with a smile tinged with sadness. "She's a sweet girl. Her mother, well, she passed away recently. Amara's been with us ever since." Something about the girl's gaze unsettled him. There was a depth in her eyes, a maturity that seemed out of place for someone her age. As if sensing his hesitation, Amara stood, clutching the photograph tightly, and walked toward him. Her steps were small but deliberate, and for a moment the bustling room seemed to fade into the background. "Sir," she said softly, her voice trembling but firm, "my mom told me you're my dad." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. The room fell silent, and Sebastian stared at her, frozen in place. His mind raced to dismiss her claim, but something about her presence, her confidence, stopped him cold. She extended the photograph, her tiny hands trembling slightly. Sebastian hesitated before taking it, his breath hitching as his eyes fell on the image. It was an old, faded photo of himself with a woman he hadn't thought of in years. Her smile was unmistakable. Evangeline, a name he had locked away with memories he thought he'd escaped forever. Amara's voice cut through his haze. "You're him," she said, her tone unwavering now. "You're my dad." For the first time in years, Sebastian Vale, the unshakable billionaire, felt his carefully built world begin to crack. He stared into the child's determined eyes, and for the first time, he was confronted with a truth he wasn't prepared to face. Sebastian's grip tightened on the photograph, his mind swirling with memories he had long buried. Evangeline. Her name carried the weight of a past he had worked tirelessly to leave behind, a chapter of his life filled with passion, mistakes, and the one decision he had never allowed himself to revisit. He stared at the little girl standing before him, her determined eyes locking onto his. Could this really be his child? Clearing his throat, he handed the photograph back to Amara, his voice steady but cold. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said, his words clipped. Your mother must have been mistaken." Amara's small hands trembled as she took the photograph. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't back down. "She wasn't mistaken," she said firmly. "She told me you'd come one day. She said you had important things to do, but you'd find me. She promised." Sebastian opened his mouth to respond, but the director quickly stepped in, sensing the growing tension. "Perhaps this isn't the best time for such discussions," he said, his voice soft but insistent. "Amara, why don't you head back to your room? Mr. Vale has a busy schedule." Amara hesitated, her gaze flickering between the director and Sebastian. Finally, she turned, clutching the photograph to her chest, and walked away. Each step she took sent a pang of guilt through Sebastian's chest, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. The director let out a nervous chuckle, attempting to diffuse the awkwardness. "She's a bright girl, Mr. Vale. Her mother spoke highly of you during her time here. It's possible she mentioned your name in passing, and the child misunderstood." Sebastian turned sharply, his steely gaze locking onto the director. "Her mother stayed here?" "Yes," the director replied. "Miss Evangeline came to us shortly after Amara was born. She was struggling, never asked for much, though, just a safe place for her daughter." His voice softened. "She talked about you often, you know, said you were destined for great things." Sebastian felt a pang in his chest as Evangeline's face flashed in his mind, her vibrant smile, her sparkling eyes. The woman he had walked away from when his ambition became his sole focus. He forced himself to regain his composure, masking the guilt behind his usual air of indifference. "What happened to her?" he asked, his voice colder than he intended. The director sighed, his expression heavy with sadness. "She passed away a few months ago. Cancer. She fought hard, but it was too late by the time she sought treatment. Her last wish was for Amara to be cared for here, in case—" He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "In case no one came for her." Sebastian turned away, his jaw tightening. The director's words lingered, piercing through the armor he had spent years building. He glanced toward the hallway where Amara had disappeared, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. Was she truly his daughter? Could Evangeline have hidden something this monumental from him? Would it be possible to verify this claim? Sebastian asked finally, his tone sharp but controlled. The director straightened. "We can assist you with that, Mr. Vale. If you'd like, I can arrange for the necessary paperwork to confirm Amara's parentage." Sebastian gave a curt nod, his expression unreadable. "Do it." As the director excused himself, Sebastian remained rooted in place, his thoughts racing. He had come here expecting to deliver a speech, shake a few hands, and leave. Instead, he was confronted with a possibility that could unravel the very life he had built. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to think logically. Until he had proof, there was no room for emotion, no room for weakness. But as he turned to leave, a quiet voice echoed in his mind. "You're him, you're my dad." He shook his head, trying to dismiss the words, but they clung to him like the rain outside, refusing to be ignored. Sebastian returned to the limousine in silence, the sound of the rain tapping against the roof matching the rhythm of his racing thoughts. The photograph of Evangeline and himself lingered in his mind, stirring a storm of emotions he hadn't felt in years. He loosened his tie, a rare show of discomfort, and leaned back in the leather seat, staring out at the blurred streets. "Where to, Mr. Vale?" the driver asked, glancing at him through the rearview mirror. "Back to the office," Sebastian replied curtly. He needed space to think, away from the eyes of curious onlookers. The car merged into traffic, but the distance from the orphanage did nothing to ease the weight pressing on his chest. As the skyscrapers of the business district came into view, Sebastian's phone buzzed on the seat beside him. He picked it up and saw a message from Laura Kyan, his trusted assistant. Preliminary research on Evangeline started. Will update you ASAP. Sebastian tapped out a reply. Make it fast. Laura was efficient, sharp, and loyal, qualities he valued above all else. If anyone could unearth the truth about Evangeline's past and Amara's claim, it was her. But as much as he relied on facts and logic, he couldn't deny the uneasy feeling gnawing at him. Arriving at his office, Sebastian walked through the towering glass doors with his usual commanding presence. But inside, he was anything but composed. The sterile hum of the elevator offered no solace, and the walls of his private office, adorned with awards and certificates, felt cold and distant. Laura entered moments later, a file tucked under her arm and a concerned expression on her face. I've managed to pull some initial records, she said, placing the folder on his desk. Evangeline lived at the orphanage for several years after Amara was born. No known relatives or legal documentation about the father. Your name wasn't listed anywhere. Sebastian flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing as he scanned the details. Evangeline's name, the dates, and the records of her illness painted a picture of struggle and resilience. But nothing offered definitive proof of what Amara claimed. Anything else? He asked, his voice clipped. Laura hesitated before speaking. There's a note. It was found in her belongings at the orphanage after she passed. She pulled out a sealed envelope and handed it to him. It's addressed to you. Sebastian's breath caught as he stared at the envelope. His name was written in Evangeline's familiar handwriting, the letters slightly slanted as though she had written it in haste. He slid his finger under the flap, pulling out a single piece of paper. The words were simple, but they struck him with the force of a tidal wave. Sebastian, if you're reading this, it means Amara found you. I wasn't sure I had the right to tell her about you, but I knew one day she'd need to know where she came from. Please, don't turn her away. She deserves more than I could give her. The paper trembled slightly in his hands, his mind replaying the moments he had shared with Evangeline all those years ago. The laughter, the arguments, the passion, all of it came rushing back, colliding with the cold reality of the present. Mr. Vale? Laura's voice broke the silence, her tone tentative. What do you want me to do next? Sebastian didn't respond immediately. He folded the letter and placed it carefully back into the envelope. Arrange a DNA test, he said finally, his voice low. I want answers. Laura nodded and left the room, leaving Sebastian alone with his thoughts. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as the letter's words echoed in his mind. She deserves more than I could give her. For the first time in years, Sebastian wondered if there was something in his life that no amount of money or power could replace. The DNA test was arranged within hours, the efficiency of Sebastian's resources ensuring there were no delays. The process itself was clinical, quick swabs, signatures on forms, and instructions to wait for the results. Sebastian stood stiffly in the orphanage's small office, watching as Amara followed the nurse's directions without hesitation. She had the same calm demeanor as before, a quiet strength that unsettled him. When it was over, Amara glanced up at him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. Hope? Curiosity? Or perhaps a sense of certainty he didn't yet share. Does this mean you believe me now? She asked, her voice steady but soft. Sebastian met her gaze, his expression unreadable. It means we'll have answers soon, he said, avoiding a direct response. The truth was, he wasn't sure what he believed. Every instinct he had told him to remain detached, to wait for the facts. But something about Amara, her quiet resilience, her unwavering belief, chipped away at his defenses. Before he could say more, the director entered the room, his presence a welcome distraction. Mr. Vale, thank you for taking this step, he said warmly. While we wait, I'd like to invite you to spend some time with the children. It would mean a great deal to them. Sebastian hesitated. The last thing he wanted was to linger in this place, surrounded by the weight of unspoken emotions and unanswerable questions. But Amara's expectant gaze shifted his resolve. Without a word, he nodded, following the director into the main hall. The children greeted him with shy smiles and wide eyes, their excitement bubbling over as they introduced themselves. Amara stayed close but didn't say much, watching him interact with the others. Despite his initial discomfort, Sebastian found himself softening under their innocent enthusiasm. They asked him questions, some about his work, others about his life, and for the first time in a long time, he answered without pretense. As the hours passed, Sebastian noticed Amara slowly edging closer. She didn't demand his attention like the other children, but seemed content just to be near him. At one point, she tugged on his sleeve and pointed toward a bookshelf filled with worn-out books. "Mom used to read me stories from there," she said. "Do you like stories?" Sebastian glanced at the shelf, its contents clearly well-loved. "I used to," he admitted, surprised by his own honesty. "But it's been a while." Amara's face lit up, and she selected a book with a faded cover. "Then you should read this one." It was her favorite. Before he could respond, she handed it to him, her small fingers brushing his. The gesture was simple, but it carried a weight he couldn't ignore. He opened the book, the scent of old paper and memories wafting up to meet him. Inside the front cover, a name was scrawled in familiar handwriting: Evangeline Vale. His chest tightened. She had signed her name as if claiming this book as a piece of herself, a piece she had left behind for Amara. Sebastian's thumb grazed the ink, his mind a whirlwind of questions and regrets. How had he let it come to this? How had he allowed so much time to slip away? Amara tilted her head, watching him carefully. "Did you know her favorite story was about a man who found something he didn't know he'd lost?" she asked innocently. Sebastian closed the book, the words striking closer to home than he cared to admit. "I didn't," he said, his voice quieter now. "But I'd like to know." The children's laughter echoed in the background, mingling with the sound of rain against the windows. For the first time that day, Sebastian felt the faintest flicker of connection, not just to Amara, but to the part of himself he thought he'd buried long ago. As they sat together, the hours melted into moments, and the distance between them began to shrink. But even as Sebastian felt the walls around his heart begin to soften, the uncertainty of what the DNA results might reveal loomed large, casting a shadow over the fragile bond forming between them. The next day, Sebastian found himself pacing in his office, his nerves fraying as he waited for the DNA results. The folder Laura had delivered sat unopened on his desk, its contents threatening to shatter or solidify everything. His grip tightened around the edge of his chair, his mind racing with possibilities. What if she was his daughter? What if she wasn't? Both answers felt equally daunting. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, he grabbed the folder and flipped it open. His eyes scanned the document, the words blurring momentarily before coming into sharp focus. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. The paper trembled in his hands. There it was, undeniable proof that Amara was his daughter. The child he hadn't known existed for nearly 8 years. A rush of emotions surged through him: shock, guilt, fear. But above all, a strange and unfamiliar sense of responsibility. Before he could process what to do next, Laura entered the office. "Mr. Vale?" she asked cautiously. "Have you seen the results?" Sebastian nodded, his throat dry. "She's mine," he said, the words feeling heavy in his mouth. Laura's face softened. "What now?" He didn't answer immediately. What now? The question lingered in the air, daunting and unanswerable. He had spent his life building an empire, mastering control over every aspect of his existence. But this was different. This wasn't a boardroom or a balance sheet. This was a little girl with eyes that mirrored his own, a child who had been waiting for him, whether he deserved it or not. After a long pause, he straightened. "I need to see her," he said firmly. "Arrange for another visit to the orphanage. Today." When Sebastian arrived at the orphanage that afternoon, he carried an air of determination that hadn't been there before. The children greeted him with the same excitement, but his focus was singular. Amara was sitting in the courtyard, her curly hair shining in the sunlight as she read a book. She looked up as he approached, her expression cautious but hopeful. "Hi," she said, closing the book and clutching it to her chest. "Hi," Sebastian replied, his voice softer than usual. He hesitated, unsure how to begin. Words had always been his weapon, his shield, but now they felt inadequate. Finally, he said, "I got the results." Amara's eyes widened slightly, her grip on the book tightening. "And?" Sebastian knelt in front of her, his usually unyielding demeanor giving way to vulnerability. "You were right," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm your dad." For a moment, Amara said nothing. Her expression shifted from surprise to something deeper, relief perhaps, or validation. She blinked rapidly, as if trying to hold back tears, and then, without warning, she threw her arms around his neck. "I knew it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I knew you'd come for me." Sebastian froze, the weight of her small arms around him almost overwhelming. Slowly, he returned the embrace, his hands resting gently on her back. For the first time in years, he felt the icy barriers around his heart begin to thaw. As they pulled apart, Amara looked up at him with a shy smile. "Does this mean I can go with you now?" The question hit him harder than he expected. The truth was, he didn't know if he was ready for that step. His life was a carefully constructed world of schedules and solitude, and the thought of disrupting it terrified him. But looking into her hopeful eyes, he knew he couldn't leave her behind. "I don't have all the answers yet," he admitted. "But I'll figure it out. I promise," Amara nodded, her trust in him unshaken. "Mom always said you'd do the right thing." Sebastian's chest tightened at the mention of Evangeline. "Your mom was an incredible woman," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "She deserved better from me." Amara tilted her head. "She always said you were doing important things. She never blamed you." Her words, simple yet profound, struck a chord deep within him. Evangeline's faith in him, even after everything, felt like both a blessing and a burden. He silently vowed not to fail her again. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the courtyard, Sebastian realized that his life was no longer just his own. He had a daughter now, a responsibility, a connection, and perhaps a second chance. The ride back to his penthouse was a quiet one. Amara sat beside him in the limousine, clutching her book tightly as she stared out at the bustling city. Sebastian glanced at her occasionally, struggling to reconcile the whirlwind of emotions coursing through him. The DNA results had confirmed what he hadn't been ready to accept, but now that she was here, truly here, his once organized world felt as if it were teetering on the edge of chaos. Amara finally broke the silence. "Your car is really big," she said, her tone filled with the kind of curiosity only a child could muster. "Do you drive it yourself sometimes?" Sebastian smirked faintly. "No, I have a driver." "Why?" she asked, turning to face him fully. "Don't you like driving?" "It's not about liking it," he replied. "It's about efficiency. I can work while someone else drives." Amara wrinkled her nose. "That doesn't sound fun." Her response made him chuckle, surprising even himself. "Fun isn't usually my priority." Amara tilted her head, studying him. "Maybe it should be." Her innocent remark hung in the air, cutting through his carefully built defenses with disarming simplicity. Sebastian shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond, and instead turned his attention back to the window. But Amara's words lingered, a quiet reminder of how little he truly understood about this new role he'd been thrust into. When they arrived at his penthouse, Amara's eyes widened at the towering building. "You live all the way up there?" she asked, craning her neck to look at the top floors. Sebastian nodded. "It's quiet. Peaceful." She followed him inside, her small steps echoing in the cavernous lobby. As they entered his home, Amara's awe was unmistakable. The sleek, modern interior was a stark contrast to the cozy but worn orphanage she had come from. She wandered cautiously, her fingers brushing against the edges of furniture, the cool marble floors reflecting her every movement. "This place is huge," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "Do you live here alone?" "Yes," Sebastian replied simply. "Doesn't it get lonely?" The question stopped him in his tracks. Lonely? He hadn't thought about it in those terms before, but now, standing in his pristine, meticulously organized home, he realized how fitting the word was. For years, he had buried himself in work, avoiding anything that resembled vulnerability or connection. But now, with Amara here, the emptiness of his surroundings felt glaringly obvious. "I don't think about it much," he said finally, avoiding her gaze. Amara wandered into the living room, her attention drawn to a grand piano sitting near the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Do you play?" she asked, running her fingers lightly along the keys. "I used to," Sebastian admitted, surprised at how easily the words came. "A long time ago." "Can you play something now?" He hesitated, the thought of sitting down at the piano stirring memories he wasn't sure he was ready to confront. But the hopeful look on Amara's face was impossible to ignore. Slowly he sat down, his fingers hovering over the keys as if they were foreign to him. After a moment's pause, he began to play, a soft, melancholic tune that filled the room like a distant echo of the past. Amara sat beside him, watching intently, her small hands resting in her lap. When he finished, she clapped softly, her smile bright and genuine. "That was beautiful," she said. "Mom used to hum a song like that. Was it one you taught her?" Sebastian's chest tightened, memories of Evangeline's laughter and warmth flooding his mind. "It might have been," he said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. Amara reached over and placed her hand on his. "She always said you were good at music. She said you were good at a lot of things." Her touch, so small yet grounding, was enough to bring him back to the present. He looked at her and realized for the first time that this wasn't just about filling a role or fulfilling a responsibility. It was about building something real, something he hadn't allowed himself to believe he could have. As the evening wore on, the once cold walls of Sebastian's home seemed a little warmer. Amara's laughter echoed through the space, softening the edges of a life that had been too sharp for too long. And as he tucked her into the guest room that night, her small frame curled up under the blankets. He found himself lingering by the door, watching her sleep. For the first time in years, Sebastian Vale felt something unfamiliar and extraordinary. Hope. The morning sunlight poured through the expansive windows of Sebastian's penthouse, casting golden streaks across the polished floors. He stood in the kitchen, sipping his coffee, his mind preoccupied with the day ahead. Despite the calm exterior of his surroundings, the weight of his new reality pressed heavily on him. He wasn't just a man managing an empire anymore. He was a father. From the hallway came the faint sound of footsteps. Amara appeared, her hair tousled from sleep, clutching the book she'd brought from the orphanage. She looked around the immaculate kitchen with wide eyes. "Do you cook?" she asked, her voice still sleepy. Sebastian set his cup down and offered a small smirk. "Not exactly." "Then who makes your food?" she asked, climbing onto one of the high stools by the counter. "I have a chef," he replied, gesturing toward the industrial-style kitchen that looked more like an art installation than a place where meals were made. Amara wrinkled her nose. "Mom always cooked. She said food tastes better when it's made with love." The words hit him harder than he expected, stirring an ache he hadn't felt in years. He leaned against the counter, folding his arms. "Your mom? She was good at a lot of things." Amara tilted her head. "Did you love her?" Sebastian froze, caught off guard by the directness of the question. He opened his mouth to answer, but hesitated, the truth catching in his throat. Finally, he said, "Yes, I did." Amara nodded as if the answer confirmed something she already knew. "She always said you were trying to do something important. That's why you weren't with us." Her words were like a mirror reflecting his failures back at him. He swallowed the lump in his throat, his voice quieter now. "I thought I was doing the right thing back then, but I was wrong." Amara stared at him for a moment before hopping down from the stool. "I'm hungry," she said, changing the subject in the way only a child could. Sebastian blinked, then nodded. "Let's see what we can do about that." An hour later, they sat together at the dining table, a spread of pancakes, fruit, and juice before them. Sebastian's chef had come and gone, leaving behind a meal that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Amara poked at her pancake with her fork, clearly amused. "They're so perfect," she said, giggling. Mom's pancakes were always messy. Sometimes they had funny shapes. Sebastian chuckled softly. "Messy can be good." "Do you think I could make pancakes here?" she asked, her eyes lighting up. "You could help." He hesitated, the image of himself in an apron flipping pancakes, almost laughable. But then he saw the hope in her eyes, the way she leaned forward in anticipation. "We'll give it a try," he said finally. Amara beamed, and the warmth of her smile made the cavernous room feel just a little smaller. Later that day, Sebastian sat in his office, reviewing paperwork while Amara explored the penthouse. Laura called, her voice as efficient and professional as always. "Mr. Vale, there's a development regarding the orphanage." "What kind of development?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. "The funding situation is worse than we initially thought. They're struggling to stay open," Laura explained. "If nothing changes, they may have to shut down within a year." Sebastian's jaw tightened. The thought of children like Amara being displaced stirred something protective within him. "What do they need?" he asked. "A lot," Laura replied. "Renovations, additional staff, resources for the kids. It's a long list." Sebastian nodded, his mind already working. "Put together a plan. I want to know exactly how much it'll take to secure their future." Laura hesitated. "Are you sure you want to take this on?" "Just do it," he said firmly. "It's not up for debate." As he hung up, he heard Amara's voice calling from the other room. He followed the sound and found her sitting on the floor, flipping through the book she had brought from the orphanage. "This place is really nice," she said without looking up, "but it doesn't feel like home." Sebastian paused, her words sinking in. He crouched down beside her. "What does home feel like to you?" She looked up, her eyes earnest. "It's not about the place. It's about the people. Mom said home is where the people you love are." Her words struck a chord deep within him. For all his wealth and success, Sebastian realized he had been living in a house, not a home. And now, for the first time, he wondered if Amara was the missing piece that could change that. Sebastian couldn't stop thinking about what Amara had said. "Home is where the people you love are." The words lingered in his mind like a quiet echo, forcing him to confront the reality of his carefully constructed life. For years, his penthouse had been a fortress, a place where he could isolate himself from the world and its complications. Now, with Amara's presence, the walls felt less like protection and more like barriers he needed to dismantle. The next morning, as the sun streamed through the windows, Amara wandered into his office, her curls slightly tousled and her book tucked under her arm. She paused at the doorway, her small frame almost swallowed by the grandeur of the space. "What are you doing?" she asked, tilting her head curiously. "Work," Sebastian replied, gesturing to the pile of documents on his desk. "Lots of it." Amara scrunched her nose. "Mom used to say you worked too much. She said you needed to learn how to have fun." Sebastian chuckled despite himself. She wasn't wrong. Amara crossed the room and climbed into the chair opposite his desk. "Do you ever take breaks?" "Not often," he admitted, setting down his pen. "Why?" she shrugged, swinging her legs beneath the chair. "Maybe you should. We could do something fun." "Fun?" he echoed, as if the concept were foreign to him. "Like what?" Amara thought for a moment, then grinned. "The park. Mom and I used to go all the time. We could feed the ducks." Sebastian blinked, his mind flashing to memories of Evangeline describing their outings. The image of her and Amara sitting by a pond, tossing breadcrumbs to ducks, felt both distant and strangely intimate. He hesitated, then nodded. "The park it is." The park was alive with activity. Children laughing, joggers weaving through the paths, and the faint melody of a street performer playing a guitar. Amara darted ahead, her energy infectious as she clutched a small bag of breadcrumbs she'd insisted they bring. Sebastian followed, his usual polished demeanor slightly out of place amidst the casual atmosphere. At the edge of a pond, Amara knelt by the water, tossing bits of bread to a group of eager ducks. Sebastian stood nearby, watching her with a mix of curiosity and caution. He wasn't used to this, to stepping away from his responsibilities and simply existing in the moment. "Come on," Amara called, waving him over. "You have to try it." Sebastian sighed, loosening his tie before crouching beside her. She handed him a handful of breadcrumbs, and he hesitated before tossing one into the water. A duck immediately snapped it up, earning a giggle from Amara. "See? It's easy," she said, her smile bright. Sebastian found himself smiling back, a genuine warmth spreading through him. For a brief moment, the weight of his world seemed to lift. They stayed by the pond for a while, Amara chattering about everything and nothing, her laughter filling the air like music. As they walked back toward the car, Amara glanced up at him. "Do you think Mom would have liked today?" Sebastian's chest tightened at the question. He looked down at her, his voice soft. "I think she would have loved it." Amara nodded, satisfied. "She always said you had a good heart, even if you didn't know it." Her words struck him harder than he expected, leaving him momentarily speechless. Evangeline's faith in him, even after all these years, was a truth he wasn't sure he deserved. But as he looked at Amara, he realized he wanted to live up to it, not for Evangeline, but for the little girl who had given him a chance to find something he hadn't known he was missing. As they drove back to the penthouse, Sebastian found himself thinking about the future. For years, his life had been defined by ambition, control, and isolation. Now, with Amara beside him, the path ahead felt uncertain, but not unwelcome. It felt hopeful. The following weeks passed in a blur, and Sebastian found himself navigating uncharted territory. Balancing his demanding career with the responsibilities of being a father wasn't something he had prepared for, but Amara's presence began to weave its way into his life in unexpected ways. Meetings that once felt critical now seemed trivial compared to the moments he spent with her. In the mornings, she would sit at the kitchen counter, munching on cereal while peppering him with questions about his work. At night, she would curl up on the couch with her book, while he reviewed contracts, her quiet presence filling the emptiness of his penthouse. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. For the first time in years, Sebastian felt his home becoming more than just a space. It was starting to feel like a place he wanted to return to. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, Amara suddenly looked up from her book. "Can I ask you something?" she said, her tone hesitant. Sebastian set down the report he was reading and gave her his full attention. "Of course." "Why didn't you come find me sooner?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of its implications. Sebastian leaned back in his chair, his fingers interlocking as he searched for the right words. "I didn't know you existed," he admitted, his voice steady but tinged with regret. "If I had known, I would have been there." Amara studied him carefully, her expression unreadable. "Mom said you were really busy. She said you had important things to do." Sebastian felt his chest tighten. Evangeline had protected him in ways he didn't deserve, sparing Amara the truth of his absence. "Your mom, she wanted the best for you," he said softly. "And she wanted you to believe the best about me, even when I didn't deserve it." Amara tilted her head. "You do now." Her words hit him like a wave, washing away some of the guilt he had been carrying. He reached across the table and placed a hand over hers, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." The next day, Sebastian returned to the orphanage with Amara by his side. It was a planned visit, but this time his intentions were different. Instead of a quick tour or a PR photo opportunity, he wanted to speak to the director about the financial challenges they faced. The director greeted them warmly, his relief evident. "Mr. Vale, it's good to see you again, and Amara, it's always a pleasure." Amara beamed, and Sebastian nodded. "I wanted to discuss the orphanage's future," he said, his tone businesslike but genuine. "I understand you're facing some serious difficulties." The director sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "That's putting it mildly. We're doing everything we can, but donations have been scarce, and the building itself is in desperate need of repairs." Sebastian folded his arms, his sharp gaze scanning the room. What would it take to ensure this place stays open? The director hesitated, clearly taken aback by the question. "It would take a substantial amount," he admitted. "More than we've ever received in a single donation." Sebastian didn't flinch. "I want a full breakdown of your needs, renovations, staffing, supplies. Whatever it takes, I'll make it happen." The director's eyes widened, gratitude flooding his expression. "Mr. Vale, I don't know what to say. This would change everything for these children." Sebastian glanced down at Amara, who was listening intently. He rested a hand on her shoulder, his voice softening. "It's the least I can do." As they left the director's office, Amara tugged at his sleeve. "You're helping them?" she asked, her eyes shining. Sebastian nodded. "I am." "Mom would be proud," she said simply. Her words brought a lump to his throat, but he managed a small smile. "I hope so." As they walked through the halls of the orphanage, the children's laughter echoed around them, blending with the distant sound of rain tapping against the windows. For the first time in years, Sebastian felt like he was doing something that truly mattered, not for his reputation, not for his empire, but for the people who needed him most. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Sebastian immersed himself in plans for the orphanage, pouring resources into its renovation and working with his team to secure its long-term stability. The more time he spent on the project, the more he realized it wasn't just about the building or the children, it was about making amends. For years, he had measured his success in profits and power, but now he was beginning to see a different kind of legacy. Amara, too, found her place in his world. She accompanied him to meetings, often surprising his staff with her curious questions and unfiltered honesty. "Why do you need so many papers?" she had once asked during a boardroom presentation, drawing laughter from everyone except Sebastian, who struggled to hide his smirk. She brought a lightness to his days that he hadn't realized he was missing. But as much as their bond grew, there were moments of doubt, moments when Sebastian questioned whether he was truly capable of being the father Amara needed. One evening, as they sat on the couch, Amara looked up from her book and asked, "Do you think I'll like living here forever?" The question caught him off guard. "Forever?" he echoed. "Well, yeah," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "I mean, this is my home now, right?" Sebastian hesitated, his mind racing. He hadn't yet addressed the legal aspects of her custody, assuming there would be time to figure it out later. But now, looking into her hopeful eyes, he realized later wasn't good enough. She needed certainty. She needed to know she belonged. "Yes," he said firmly, "this is your home, and it always will be." Her face lit up and she leaned against him, her small frame fitting perfectly against his side. "Good," she said, her voice muffled, "because I like it here, and I like you." Sebastian's chest tightened at her words. For all his power and influence, he had never felt as humbled or as whole as he did in that moment. But just as life seemed to be settling into a rhythm, a storm loomed on the horizon. One afternoon, Sebastian received a call from Laura. Her voice, typically steady, carried an unusual edge of tension. "Mr. Vale," she began, "there's something you need to know. A legal claim has been filed regarding Amara's custody." Sebastian's grip on the phone tightened. "What kind of claim?" "A distant relative of Evangeline's has come forward, claiming they have the right to care for her," Laura explained. "It's a weak case, but it could complicate things." Sebastian's jaw clenched. He hadn't anticipated this, hadn't prepared for the possibility that someone else might try to take Amara away. "What do we know about this relative?" "Very little so far," Laura admitted. "But I've already started digging. We'll need to act quickly." Sebastian's mind raced. He had spent his life navigating high-stakes negotiations and hostile takeovers, but this was different. This wasn't just about winning, it was about protecting the fragile bond he had built with Amara. He wouldn't lose her. Not now. Later that evening, as he tucked Amara into bed, he studied her peaceful expression, the way her curls framed her face. She looked so small, so vulnerable, and the thought of her being taken away filled him with a fierce determination. "Good night, Dad," she murmured, her voice drowsy but filled with trust. Sebastian swallowed hard, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Good night, sweetheart." As he left her room, his resolve hardened. He would fight for her, not just because he owed it to Evangeline, but because Amara was his daughter. She was his family, and he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. The following weeks were a blur of legal meetings, court filings, and tense conversations. Sebastian's life had always revolved around control, but this battle felt personal in a way nothing else ever had. The claim from Evangeline's distant cousin, someone who had never been involved in Amara's life, was based solely on biology, a thin argument at best. But Sebastian knew the courts wouldn't see it that way. The system often favored blood relations, and the thought of losing Amara to someone who barely knew her sent a surge of fear through him. Amara remained blissfully unaware of the turmoil unfolding behind the scenes. Sebastian made sure of it, shielding her from the uncertainty while working tirelessly with his legal team. Laura had outdone herself, uncovering inconsistencies in the cousin's story and gathering evidence that highlighted Sebastian's growing bond with Amara. "She's thriving with you," Laura said during one late-night briefing. "The judge will see that. We just need to make sure your commitment is undeniable." Sebastian nodded, his determination unwavering. "I won't let them take her." The day of the custody hearing arrived, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Amara's cousin sat across from Sebastian, their posture stiff and their arguments rehearsed. They claimed they could provide stability and a sense of family that Amara needed. But as the proceedings unfolded, it became clear their motivations weren't entirely selfless. Sebastian's team exposed gaps in their story, pointing out their lack of prior involvement in Amara's life and their questionable financial stability. When it was Sebastian's turn to speak, he stood, his usual confidence tempered by the weight of the moment. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, "I didn't know Amara existed until a few weeks ago, but from the moment I met her, I knew she was my daughter. I can't change the past, but I can promise her a future filled with love, stability, and opportunity. She deserves that, and I'm prepared to give her everything I have to make sure she gets it." He paused, his gaze flicking to Amara, who was seated quietly with a social worker. "Amara has been through so much already. She's lost her mother, and now she's facing the possibility of losing the life she's just started to build. I won't let that happen. She is my daughter, and I love her." His words hung in the air, and for the first time in a long while, Sebastian felt vulnerable. But he didn't regret it. The truth was on his side, and he hoped it would be enough. When the judge finally rendered the decision, the courtroom was silent. "After reviewing the evidence and considering the best interests of the child," the judge said, "custody of Amara Vale will remain with her biological father, Sebastian Vale." Sebastian exhaled deeply, relief washing over him like a wave. Across the room, Amara's cousins sighed and gathered their things, clearly disappointed but not hostile. Sebastian respected their effort, even if he couldn't agree with it. Amara ran to him as soon as the court adjourned, throwing her arms around his waist. "Does this mean I'm staying with you forever?" she asked, her voice muffled against his jacket. He knelt down, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. "Yes," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Forever." Life after the hearing settled into a new rhythm. The renovations at the orphanage were well underway, and Sebastian made regular visits with Amara to check on the progress. He had also started setting aside time in his busy schedule to simply be present, whether it was reading her favorite stories at night, playing board games, or even attempting to make pancakes on Saturday mornings. One evening, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the city, Amara turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think Mom knows we're okay?" she asked. Sebastian wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "I think she does," he said, his voice tinged with emotion, "and I think she'd be proud of you." Amara smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "She'd be proud of you, too." The words struck him deeply, and for a moment he simply sat in silence, letting them sink in. In the distance, the city lights twinkled like stars, a reminder of the life he had built. But for the first time, those lights felt secondary to the little girl beside him, the one who had turned his house into a home. As the night deepened, Sebastian realized that his life, once defined by ambition and solitude, had found a new purpose. It wasn't about power or success anymore. It was about love, family, and the second chance he never saw coming. And for that, he would always be grateful.